plenty of artists, writers, musicians, you name it, who have been framed as the apogee of Bohemia, typical of the modern city culture at the turn of the century. This video intends to profile James Abbott McNeill Whistler, less so as the one and only dandy who deserves our utmost attention, but merely as one of the many. He was an amusing character with some entertaining stories, which will be told throughout the next several minutes, as well as a painter whose work I enjoy. I would like to define Coxcombe, the word in the title of this video, as it will come up again later in the context of a legal trial. You may well be aware of this vernacular, however for those of you who aren't, the 16th century definition would inform us it alludes to a conceited fool. However, by the end of the 19th century it came to mean more so that of a dandy. That is, it was used by those who wished to derogate dandies, who came to stand as a kind of symbol of modernity and all the self-absorption it came with. So if you learn nothing from this video, at least there's this outdated word which bears little if not no resemblance to our contemporary world. Whistler was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, but as Professor Daniel Sutherland notes in his wonderful lecture linked in the description, Whistler was ashamed of the demure factory town he had been born in, instead spending his life saying, "I don't choose to be born in Lowell, I shall choose to be born where I want to." His father was an engineer. Whistler himself was a failed army cadet. After failing the examination, he headed for Paris, where the bohemian aura drew him like a moth to a popular flame. He had been a contrarian child, from a reasonably financially comfortable family, thus the appeal of the avant-garde was all too tempting of a proposal to pass up. It's widely discussed too that with the growth in newspapers and modern media, Whistler, a figure very much on the scene and in the social sphere, began to use this as a tool, understanding early celebrity and mediatised reputation. He eventually settled in London, spending the majority of his career there inspired by the Thames and city scenes, eventually dying there too. He was an aesthete, one who believed in art for art's sake, as was a popular ideology at the time, spearheaded by the likes of Oscar Wilde. It consisted mostly of male socialites relishing in breaking social boundaries with art, prose, poetry and fashion, and the rest. There is an interesting vein to aestheticism, or art for art's sake, which saw some of the associated figures of the movement exploring public displays of homosexuality for the first time in the modern period, which, as one can imagine, was met with plenty of retaliation. There is an amusing selection of caricatures from Punch magazine, which are worth a search, that put the aesthetes in the position of ridicule. In general, a flamboyant confidence was frowned upon. I have a wonderful podcast recommendation if this line of inquiry interests you, called Bad Gays, which is a spin-off podcast from the book of the same title, written by Ben Miller and Hugh Lemmy, which subverts the popular contemporary depiction of LGBTQ+ people in history as heroes of their own story. The writers are both gay themselves and wanted to include the less heroic stories of gay people in history so as to insert an alternative perspective to the one-sided view we are currently being fed. Most specific to this video, the episode on Lord Alfred Douglas, or Bosie, Oscar Wilde's long-term partner, bears relevance. Back to Whistler. Here's what he had to say on Art pour l'art. Art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear, without confounding this with emotions entirely foreign to it, as devotion, pity, love, patriotism and the like. Whistler once made a peacock room. For want of not making this video longer than it needs to be, beautiful though it is, I have left details of this story out of this video. There is, however, a gorgeous video up on the V&A's channel covering the time they recreated it. I have left this in the description. Aestheticism, or art for art's sake, was heavily informed by Orientalism, which was taking place in European art at the time due to an increase in trade between the West and the Far East. A staple of Whistler's paintings became his butterfly signature, which started off as a kind of palimpsest of his initials, but then evolved into a more animated feature of his paintings. His butterfly grew a stinger for a tail as time went on, symbolising his devious side as well as his penchant for beauty. Butterflies were a popular curiosity at the time, being used for their symbolism as a creature which undergoes a transformation, and yet having a brief and fleeting life, kind of like the fast-paced and rapid development of modern life. We can think of works such as Franz Kafka's seminal Metamorphosis, published in 1915. As noticed by Kermit S. Tramper, you can read some of Whistler's more abstract works like a music score. This works particularly well with his nocturnes. If we take his Nocturne in Blue and Gold, Valparaiso, the work appears to be split into a series of horizontal bands. Champa identified that this highly resembled the staves in a blank music score, and Whistler's staves have been adorned by pictorial features like the sails of boats in the distance, whose masts look like the stems of quavers, crotchets or minims. The golden light freckles across the upper part of the painting, as if defining the music's melody. In the foreground, loose figures are implied on a jetty. The Valparaiso pictured in this painting is worlds apart from the jostling city in Chile, which was having somewhat of a quote-unquote golden era at the time, as a popular seaport, welcoming a multitude of travellers from far and wide. But Whistler saw his urban landscapes as material for great calm. An overwhelming darkness exudes throughout a lot of his depictions of urban environments, yet flecks of light implying human activity and modern industry inject a gaiety which I find comes to override the daunting black of the night. A critic once said of his work that he could paint air. The flatness and small flickering details of his pictures have been discussed to have been influenced by the Japanese prints which were filtering into Europe, as mentioned earlier. His night pictures are leaps and bounds freer than his figurative ones, though those are pretty well realised in their own respect. Whistler also names his portrait after musical compositions. See here a series of symphonies. It was thought that he wished for paintings, like music, to be experienced with a purity of feeling. Like listening to a song and letting the orchestra or melody guide us, he desired the same of his pictures. One of the most obtuse opposers of art for art's sake was the British 19th century art critic John Ruskin. Ruskin had championed the Pre-Raphaelites and had an overwhelming influence on what art was in vogue. He firmly believed in art representing a moral message and nature as a demonstration of God's work. In 1877, Ruskin came across Whistler's Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, which was on sale for an apparently extortionate price of 200 guineas. Ruskin immediately wrote of the Whistler painting saying, "I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." And how did the peacocking Whistler stage his counter-attack against this public smear? He took Ruskin to court. This was perceived as ridiculous then as it seems today, though it is widely viewed that the whole affair was intended to work as a publicity stunt for Whistler. Long story short, the case was very public, and Whistler used his clever turns of phrase to slander the now ageing Ruskin, who was experiencing a decline in his health at the time. Whistler ultimately won, but the victory was small, earning him a mere farthing instead of his requested £1,000 on top of legal fees. Accounts of the case at the time demonstrate that the public saw the events that took place as crude and vulgarising the public's sense of the character of artistic production. Whistler fled for Venice, partially in embarrassment. In Ruskin's eyes, Whistler had blatantly overlooked faithfulness to nature in favour of artful abstraction. He saw Whistler's paintings as flagrant, as an over-aestheticization, if you will. Whistler produced an incredible body of work throughout his life, and there is plenty we did not discuss in this video. There is a lot of wonderful written content on him out there, and I have included 4 articles in the description which can be found via JSTOR if you have access to it. As light fades and the shadows deepen, all petty and exacting details vanish. Everything trivial disappears, and I see things as they are in great strong masses. The buttons are lost, but the sitter remains. The sitter is lost, but the shadow remains. The shadow is lost, but the picture remains. And that night cannot efface from the painter's imagination.